blood trickles down the hot stones of the inner courtyard. A boy, his eyes wide with terror, his body limp on the stained white marble steps, takes his last breath as a whole child. Beside him, bronze instruments still drip the thick red of imposed silence. There is no scream, only a muffled whisper coming from the high walls. The empire does not tolerate the sound of pain. There, on that stifling morning in Istanbul, another boy is mutilated to serve, with forced purity, the desires of a sultan. The scene is brutal, but real, and it marks the beginning of one of the most forgotten and cruel pages in Ottoman history, that of the castrated concubines, boys turned into shadows. For more than 4 centuries, the harem of the Ottoman Empire was much more than a place of pleasure. It was a theater of power, manipulation, and control. Amidst the silk curtains and golden mosaics, what shone was not luxury, but a meticulous choreography of submission. The castrated boys, called white eunuchs, were brought from the Balkans, Georgia, Armenia, and especially Greece. Children, torn from their mother's arms, were condemned to a fate where their own bodies became symbols of possession. The empire needed them pure, incapable of desire or procreation, perfect servants of a system that revered total control over flesh and soul. It was not just a matter of cutting bodies, but of breaking identities. By being castrated in childhood, these boys lost more than their organs. They lost their right to a future. They came to inhabit a no-man's land where they were neither men, women, nor children. They were obedient shadows, taught to walk in silence, to listen without reacting, to serve without desire. The mutilation was not only physical, it was spiritual. The empire needed to transform these beings into mirrors without a will of their own, reflecting only the desires of the throne. But what happens to a soul locked away for decades behind golden walls, without a voice, without touch, without inheritance? Ironically, many of these eunuchs rose to high positions within the palace hierarchy. Some became trusted figures of the sultans, manipulating intrigues and influences with cunning. But behind the power was emptiness, an unbearable loneliness that corroded them from within, like rust under the veneer of authority. Their bodies wasted away, their eyes darkened, and nightmares, memories of the day they were castrated, returned like invisible daggers. The luxury of the palace hid mysterious illnesses, silent depression, and, in many cases, early deaths.
This story is not only about historical barbarism, but about what happens when purity is imposed by violence and when the body is taken as property of the state. It is a warning about the more subtle forms of castration that still exist today, not with blades, but with fear, silence, and exclusion. This dark episode of the Ottoman past makes us look inward. How many parts of ourselves still live imprisoned in invisible harems, silenced by voices of power that tell us who we can and cannot be? If this topic has touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we tell stories that history has tried to forget. Leave a comment. What impacted you most about this narrative? Your voice matters, and it will not be silenced. The newly castrated boy, still feverish from the brutal improvised surgery, is wrapped in damp cloths and carried through dark corridors. The smell of dried blood and medicinal vinegar hangs in the air, mixed with the heavy incense of the imperial chambers. His body, violated and unconscious, now belongs to the state. When he wakes, there are no motherly hands, no words of comfort, only the coldness of the marble floor and the indifferent gaze of the guards. The first days in the harem are not about adaptation, but forced silence. Every misplaced whisper can mean the end. The eunuchs, even as children, learn early. There is no room for the soul in the golden labyrinth of power. The routine of the castrated servants is calculated down to the last millimeter. At dawn, they wash the corridors, prepare the odalisque's chambers, and silently observe every gesture of the women destined for the sultan. Touch is forbidden, and their gaze must always be fixed on the floor. With each beat of the royal drum, a new game of power begins. The eunuchs must act with precision, like pieces on a chessboard where they are not players, but replaceable pieces. Training is strict. corporal punishment is common. If one of the boys cries at night, he is beaten at dawn. There is no time to mourn, there is work to be done.
As the years pass, the surviving boys begin to rise within the harem. Some become supervisors, others confidants. They are given new clothes, fine fabrics, and oriental perfumes to mask the internal decay. But elegance is a disguise. Under the flowery tunics, their bodies age prematurely. Many suffer from chronic infections, wounds that never fully heal, voices that never deepen. Forced feminization is seen as a functional triumph, a useful refinement for the court, but inside, every glance in the mirror is a wound. Who am I, if not the shadow of what I could never be? In the harem, time does not pass as it does in the outside world. The days are long, measured by ceremonies and vigils. The night brings nightmares, memories of physical pain, of the metallic cold of the knife, of screams cut off by a gag. The walls of Topkapi do not only hold women and concubines, they imprison screams. And the eunuchs, even when promoted, carry the weight of being living reminders of the horror. The beauty of the palace contrasts with the decay of its guardians. Deep eyes, fragile bodies, shattered souls. Little by little, the emptiness begins to scream louder. No children, no inheritance, no love, no past, no future. Many turn to the Quran, seeking in Allah redemption for what has been taken from them. But even faith sometimes sounds empty when you feel that God has not seen what has been done to you. Others immerse themselves in power games. They become cruel, manipulative, mirrors of the executioners who created them. Those who cannot love learn to control. Those who cannot have a whole body learn to dominate the bodies of others. The 17th century sees the peak of this structure. Under the reign of Mehmed IV, the harem reaches its maximum splendor, and with it, its maximum degree of silent perversion. White eunuchs become key figures in the politics of the empire. They are messengers between the concubines and the sultan, guardians of state secrets, architects of palace intrigues. Those who survived mutilation now wear a gold ring on their finger and hold the fate of kings in their hands. But this gold has no shine, only the weight of those who can never be boys again.
In many accounts preserved by European travelers and court chroniclers, the figure of the chief of the white eunuchs is described as someone with supernatural authority. He commanded not only the routine of the harem, but the very breath of the concubines. His every step made the walls tremble. However, no one knew how he slept, what he dreamed, or if he still dreamed at all. Behind his coal-painted eyes lived the cry of someone who had been killed while still alive. The wound no longer bled, but it smelled of absence. And that is where the first great conflict of this tragedy arises. Men who can no longer be men, occupying positions of command in an empire that secretly despises them. They are used, but never revered. They are obeyed, but never loved. And the higher they climb, the deeper they sink. For the more they try to control the world around them, the more they lose control of what remains within themselves. The absence of a future begins to seep like mold into the inner walls of the soul. With no legacy, no descendants, the eunuchs begin to define their worth by how much they control. Some begin to manipulate the odalisques, threatening, punishing, and shaping their destinies according to their whims. The harem becomes a chessboard of intrigue, and what was once obedience becomes oppression. They, once victims, become executioners, but each act of violence carries the weight of their own mutilation projected onto the other. The more they hurt, the more alive they feel, or try to feel. It is at this point that the second stage of the tragedy emerges, when suffering is no longer just silent, but contagious. There are reports of eunuchs who go mad, who talk to shadows in the corridors, who write letters to no one, trying to scream what they could not say in childhood. Others become obsessed with cleanliness, with rituals, with absolute control of routines.
These are ways of denying the internal chaos, of sweeping the debris of a shattered soul under the palace's golden carpets. The contrast with the Islamic faith becomes brutal. Islam, which preaches balance, community, and continuity, now serves as the backdrop for a structure that has broken all these promises. Many of these boys grow up feeling unworthy of prayer. Others cling tightly to the sacred as their last refuge. There are eunuchs who memorize the entire Quran in search of meaning. But the mutilation of the body creates cracks even in belief. How can you pray fervently if your temple was desecrated while still under construction? In the 18th century, tensions rise. The decline of the empire begins to echo in the structures of the harem. The Ottoman elite is no longer unified. Internal conflicts arise, and the eunuchs are the first to feel the cracks. Many are accused of treason, others of witchcraft. There are secret executions inside the palace. Bodies are thrown into the Bosphorus at night so that no one can see what the empire wants to forget. The violence they suffered now returns as a cycle of punishment and fear. At this point, the narrative changes. The empire is no longer invincible. The sultan is no longer absolute. And the harem, once a symbol of imperial perfection, becomes a symbol of decadence. The silence begins to crack. Foreign documents, European travelers, Enlightenment scholars, all begin to denounce the system of castration. International shame grows. What was once a state secret is now the subject of moral debates in Parisian cafes. The world looks at Istanbul with indignation.
But it is in the hearts of the eunuchs that the tragedy reaches its peak. The turning point comes not with political downfall, but with emotional awakening. Many realize, now elderly, that they have dedicated their entire lives to a system that destroyed them. There are no children to mourn them. There are no graves with flowers. There are no names in books. They were essential, but disposable. They lived, but without ever being whole. It is the moment when tired eyes finally see the totality of their own imprisonment. It is in this abyss that the tragic narrative strikes its highest note. It is not physical pain that destroys the most. It is the belated recognition of what can never be recovered. Childhood stolen, youth fabricated, faith in something that never freed them. The body bends, but it is the soul that breaks. And at the end of this block, we ask ourselves, how many still live today imprisoned within invisible harems? How many renounce their very essence to belong to something that nullifies them? How many still kneel before empires that will never recognize them as human? The 19th century approaches with winds of change. The Ottoman Empire, already weary, extends its last forces in a world that no longer fears it. The state machine rusts, and with it, the structure of the harem begins to crumble. The influx of Western ideas, international treaties, and the growing influence of European powers force change. One of the first targets of this symbolic renewal is precisely the system of castration. The practice, although never officially acknowledged, begins to be viewed with shame. The harem, once a symbol of glory, comes to be interpreted as a monument to abuse.
But the walls of Topkapi still stand. Inside them, hundreds of eunuchs grow old like ghosts. Their functions begin to be replaced by civilian employees. They lose space, they lose authority, they lose their voice. Those who once organized the rhythm of the palace now sweep forgotten corridors or take care of moldy archives. The external decline of the empire coincides with the internal collapse of its castrated servants. The pride that sustained their rigid postures gives way to despondency. It is as if, with the end of their function, the futility of the pain that constituted them comes to the surface. There are moving accounts of abandoned eunuchs. Some live in seclusion, in small windowless chambers within the palace walls themselves. They feed on leftovers from the royal kitchen. Others flee to mosques, seeking in the sacred the dignity that the state never gave them. They are fragile bodies, deformed by a lifetime of repression. Many suffer from kidney disease, chronic infections, and early osteoporosis. What the empire did to their bodies, time finishes off. And yet, few dare to speak out.
fear remains greater than pain. As the world evolves, the last sultans tried to preserve what remains of their former glory. Abdul Hamid II, for example, reinforces the isolation of the harem in his late reign. But it is too late. The age of shadows is coming to an end, and the heavy curtain that covers the castrated concubines is beginning to unravel. The public, thirsty for scandal and hidden truths, wants to know. Foreign journalists press, European scholars write. The harem, once a secret, is now an open wound, and bleeding from it is not only the history of the eunuchs, but the hypocrisy of an empire that created them only to forget them. At this point, a question cuts through the narrative like a sharp blade. Where are the names of these men? Who were they, beyond servants? Their diaries were burned, their identities diluted under generic titles such as guardian or servant. History swallowed them up, as it swallows all victims who have no heirs to remember them. Only fragments remain: bureaucratic records, drawings, superficial descriptions. But their souls, even silent, echo in the marble of the stairs where they bled, in the corridors where they whispered prayers that no one heard.
The empire reaches its final stage. Internal revolts increase. War approaches. In 1909, the Young Turks seize power, initiating a process of aggressive modernization. And with it comes the official end of the harems. The palaces are emptied, renovated, and opened to the public as relics of the past. The eunuchs, however, have no place in this new Turkey. They are dismissed without honor, without compensation, without a home. They became beggars, vagrants, grotesque figures in the alleys of Istanbul. The empire that created them left no epitaphs. The most symbolic aspect of this process is not the end of the palaces, but what remains of their former inhabitants. They did not die in war, nor did they die heroically. They died slowly, dissolved in loneliness. Some were buried in mass graves. Others are not even buried, as if their bodies were still unworthy of a grave. It is the height of cruelty, to deny even death a gesture of dignity. And so, with the end of the castrated concubines, a cycle of 4 centuries of systematic mutilation and imperial silence comes to an end. But their pain does not disappear. It transmutes. And perhaps this is the most tragic point in the whole story. The fact that even forgotten, even erased, even wiped out, the echoes of their cries still resound in the structures that are now visited as tourist attractions. Those who walk on the floor of Topkapi also walk on the scars that sustain the luxury of an empire. Looking back, what is most frightening is not the brutality of the acts, but the normality with which they were carried out. For centuries, child castration was seen as a solution, a functional necessity. Sultans took turns on the throne, but the logic of absolute servitude remained untouchable. It is this continuity that hurts us. How much pain becomes institutionalized to the point of seeming inevitable. How much the body can be transformed into currency and the soul into protocol. And more than that, how much an entire society can remain silent as long as the spectacle remains beautiful on the outside.
The story of the castrated concubines is not just Ottoman, it is universal. It confronts us with the capacity of human beings to build empires on the bones of innocence. It shows us how faith can be used as a gag, luxury as a curtain, and tradition as a justification for horror. The silenced boys of the harem speak to us about all the silences we still tolerate today, that of exploited children, of marginalized bodies, of voices that society insists on making invisible in order to maintain its comfortable order. There is something deeply symbolic about mutilation, taking away someone's possibility of becoming. That is the essence of tragedy. The eunuchs were not killed. They were prevented from living fully. They were frozen in an identity they did not choose. This resonates today in all those who grow up hearing that they cannot, must not, have no value. In all lives interrupted not by death, but by the weight of others' control. And that is why, even though it is officially over, this story still needs to be told. Because harems continue to exist, not with stone walls,
but with social rules, misinterpreted religions, ideologies that castrate without a scalpel. The mutilated boy of the Ottoman Empire is the symbol of every human being who was silenced before discovering their voice. When we walk through the restored halls of Topkapi, we see tapestries, jewels, Chinese porcelain. But beneath the gold lies the concrete of pain. Each wall holds untold stories, each iron door a secret, and each dark corridor may still echo with the shuffling footsteps of a boy who lost more than his blood. He lost the chance to exist as he was.
The end of this narrative is not only historical, it is moral. May this tragedy teach us to listen to the silences, to look at the bodies that do not fit the norms and ask what was taken from them. May we transform the horror of the past into living consciousness in the present. It is not enough to remember. We must recognize, name, and never again allow power to use the human body as an offering. If this story touched you, if something inside you felt that silence, subscribe to this channel. Here we give voice to those who have been erased, and in the comments, tell us what other forgotten wounds does history still need to tell? Because forgetting is the second death, and we are here to prevent it from happening. The last of the white eunuchs walks slowly through the deserted corridors of Topkapi. His eyes are sunken, his steps shuffling, his skin thin as old paper. The palace no longer has kings, it no longer has odalisks, it no longer has a court. Only he remains, like an organic remnant of an extinct machine. He is no longer of use to anyone, but he also does not know how to be free. His body is old, but the silence he carries is ancient. He sits on the threshold of a half-open door, and for the first time allows the sun to touch his skin without guilt. At that moment, as he looks at the shadows cast on the cold walls, something breaks inside him. It is not physical pain, it is a crack in his soul. He looks back, as if crossing all the eras he has endured, and realizes that life was denied him from the first cut. That boy who bled on the white marble never stopped bleeding. He just learned to smile without showing his teeth, to serve without desire, to live without existing. That is when his consciousness reaches its fullness. He was not a man, nor a saint, nor a servant. He was the living ruin of a system that cultivated power at the expense of others. He walks to the fountain of the harem, where the concubines washed their feet before seeing the sultan. The water still flows, clean, indifferent to time. He dips his hand, his wrinkled skin meets the crystalline cold, and for a moment he remembers the taste of childhood. But there is no going back. The past is not a foreign country, it is an ossuary inside the chest. And there, before the trembling reflection, he sees himself for the first time without the masks of office, without the trappings of his position. Just a mutilated old man, exhausted from obeying and tired of existing. Final accounts tell of eunuchs who, upon being dismissed, slept in cemeteries, close to the earth, but still far from peace. Others slowly went mad, talking to the dead, repeating prayers like someone trying to mend a torn soul. The pain did not end with the end of the harem, it spread in echoes. It lived on in the folds of their skin, in their crooked vertebrae, in their dull eyes. When freedom finally arrived, it came too late to restore what had been destroyed in childhood. One of them, whose name has been lost in the archives, wrote with charcoal on the walls of an abandoned mosque, "Those who raised me did not want me whole, and those who freed me did not know me." This phrase sums up the fate of hundreds of castrated boys. There was never a place for them outside the harem. There was never a lap, a home, or a gravestone with flowers. They died as they were born into the empire, useful and invisible. This is the tragedy that made them eternal in pain and forgotten in history. While tourists visit Topkapi,
take pictures in the harem rooms, and gaze at the thrones and jewels with enchanted eyes. Few imagine how much blood was necessary to maintain that splendor. With every step in the marble halls, there is a missing body. With every gilded painting, a silent voice. And in every guidebook that tells of sultans and battles, there is a deafening silence about the servants without inheritance. What is not told, however, is what matters most, that absolute power always comes at a price, and that price is almost always paid by the most vulnerable.
In the last days of his life, this last eunuch, sitting among books that no one read anymore, began to record what he remembered. He wrote down names, smells, details. He tried to reconstruct the map of a world that only existed inside him. It was a late attempt to exist, to leave a mark, to say, "I was here." But when he died, no one kept his writings. They were burned with the old furniture because no one needed those memories anymore. This is the ultimate punishment of the forgotten. Not even their lamentations are preserved. But there is a justice that escapes the logic of empires, the justice of memory that resurfaces like embers under the ashes. Today, in telling this story, even centuries later, we make their silence echo. We transform lament into testimony, and the mutilated body into an eternal symbol of human resistance in the face of absurdity. It is not just a matter of looking back with horror, but of looking around with awareness. Even today, millions live in silence within structures that rob them of their essence. Even today, control over the body, faith, and identity continues to be exercised by systems that call themselves civilized. May this story not only shock, but awaken. May it cut where it needs to, at the roots of indifference. The old eunuch was buried without a name, but not without a voice. Because now, his story lives on in everyone who listens, who feels, who allows themselves to be touched by something greater than themselves. He had no children, but he has witnesses. He had no future, but now he has memories. And perhaps that is what redeems his pain, the fact that, even if late, someone finally heard him. And so, as in every classic tragedy, we end with the only possible consolation. The truth has been told, the horror has been revealed, and from the blood denied, a seed of consciousness was born. May it flourish in every generation that dares to ask, who had to be silenced for this world to be built? If this story touched you, don't let it be lost in oblivion. Subscribe to this channel. Here we give voice to the wounds that history has silenced. Like this video if it moved you, and in the comments write, what part touched you the most? What silenced stories would you like us to tell? Your listening is what transforms pain into living memory, and in this space, no one will be forgotten.